Hi everyone, it's Nene. Welcome to my channel. I focus just on Midwest true crime because I'm a Minnesota farmer's daughter. Today's case is going to bring us back to South Dakota. South Dakota. It's one of the longest cold cases in South Dakota history. So let's just get right into it. We're gonna go to Beresford, South Dakota. Beresford is in the southeast corner of South Dakota. It's a small town surrounded by farms. In 1971, Pamela Jackson and Cheryl, also known as Sherry Miller, were both 17 years old, and they were finishing up their junior year at Vermillion High School. Sherry was born to parents Melvin and Helen Miller. By the time she was a teenager, her parents had divorced, so she was living with her grandparents, Nick and Pearl Jensen. Pearl had cancer, so Sherry had kind of taken over the household duties to help out both her grandma and her grandfather around the house. She was a talented seamstress, and her goal was to move to California and start a career in fashion. She worked part-time after school at what was then known as the Dakota Hospital. It was there that she met Pamela Jackson, and the two girls became friends. Pamela, also known as Pam, was the daughter of Oscar and Adele Jackson. She grew up on the family farm. She was very thoughtful of others. She loved baking for other people, and she enjoyed planning slumber parties. Like Sherry, she was also a talented seamstress. Both girls were very well liked and described as nice girls. On the evening of May 29th, 1971, the girls got into Sherry's grandfather's car, which was a 1960 beige Studebaker. They visited Sherry's grandmother, who was in the hospital due to her cancer. They then met up with some friends in a church parking lot. Those friends told them that they were going to be heading out to a party at a gravel pit and asked if the girls wanted to go along. That's just such a rural Midwestern thing, a party in a gravel pit. We had those when I was growing up in Minnesota. At about 9:30 p.m., the girls got back into the Studebaker with Sherry behind the wheel, and they followed a car that had some boys and started heading towards that gravel pit. The boys could see Pam and Sherry in their rearview mirror, so they knew that they were behind them. But at some point as they got out into the country, the boys took a wrong turn and had to loop around and get back on the right track. And when they were back on the right road, they noticed that Pam and Sherry were no longer behind them, but they just assumed that the girls had gone ahead and continued on to the gravel pit. But when the boys got to the gravel pit, Pam and Sherry were not there. This didn't really worry too many people. Pam and Sherry were not known as party girls. I can relate to that. Hanging out in a gravel pit really wasn't something they did a lot. So a lot of the teens just assumed that the girls had changed their mind and either went home or decided to do something else. Pam's mom, Adele, used to leave the kitchen light on anytime Pam was not at home at night. And then when Pam would get home, she would turn the light off before she went to bed. About 4 a.m., Adele woke up and she noticed that the kitchen light was still on. So she went to Pam's room to see if she was sleeping and maybe just happened to forget to turn off the light, but there was no sign of Pam in her room. Pam and Oscar then started calling around to the girls' friends and other people that they knew to see if maybe the girls had spent the night at somebody's house, but everybody they talked to had seen no sign of Pam or Sherry. So the families contacted the police and reported the girls as missing. Authorities searched the gravel pit and the surrounding roads, but they couldn't see any sign of the girls. So law enforcement at that time just came to the conclusion that the girls had run away, but there really wasn't a lot to support that. Neither girl had packed any of their belongings. They hadn't left with any suitcases. The day they went missing was also a payday, and neither one had collected their last check. You'd obviously need money if you were running away. Neither of the families thought that the girls did run away, especially Sherry's family, because Sherry took care of her grandpa and grandma, and there's no way that she would have abandoned them. But police records at the time indicated that it was an assumed case of runaway teens. Just 6 days after Pam and Sherry went missing, Sherry's grandmother passed away from cancer. The police kind of pushed the case aside because they really hung on to the theory that the girls had just run away. But Oscar Jackson, Pam's dad, went full force into trying to find something that let him know what happened to his daughter that night. He walked up and down ditches, he walked in fields, went up and down the gravel roads. He would do this day after day, week after week, month after month. He'd check her social security every so often to see if anybody somebody was using it. He also spent a lot of time at the police station looking at images of unidentified deceased women in case one of those happened to be his daughter. Time kept passing on with no new info on the case. Years turned into decades. Flash way forward about 30 years to June of 2004 when South Dakota established a new cold case department, and one of the cases that department was handed was the case of Pam and Sherry. After doing some investigation, that cold case department came up with a suspect that they felt had something to do with the girl's disappearance. That suspect was David Lycan. Lycan had lived on the family farm in 1971, and it was less than a mile from where the gravel pit was that the girls were going to that night. He also knew both of the girls through church, and he even rode the school bus with Sherry. Before they disappeared, apparently somebody had heard Pam talking to somebody on the phone, saying something about how a David had hurt her hand in a car door. The Union County Sheriff in 1971, Ed Ekron, who had searched for the girls immediately after they had disappeared, said that right after the disappearance, he had went to the Lycan farm to interview the family just to see if they had seen any sign of the girls, and he claims that the family was acting very nervous when he talked to him. Lycan was a serial rapist, and in 2004, he was serving a 225-year sentence for those crimes. Authorities interviewed his younger sister, who told them that there was a burn pit on the family farm, and David often burned things in it. She also claimed to have seen a beige car on the property. Police showed her a lineup of potential cars, and she picked out a 1960 Studebaker as being similar to the car that she had seen on the farm. When they asked if she had seen anybody in the car, she said that she had seen Sherry in the driver's seat slumped over the steering wheel, and she had seen Pam in the passenger seat lying with her head against the window. Because of those details, a search warrant was obtained for the family farm, and they searched it in August and November of 2004, but found nothing that linked David to Pam and Sherry's disappearance. But everything kept indicating to this cold case department that David Lycan was the suspect, so they were able to obtain a third search warrant in 2006. So they went back out to the farm and started digging it up, and this search did find some suspicious items. They found bones, clothing, a purse, a Bible, photographs, and newspaper clippings that talked about the disappearance of Pam and Sherry. There was still no sign of the Studebaker or Pam and Sherry themselves, and even though the items were kind of suspicious, they still didn't link David to the disappearance of Pam and Sherry. The searches were kind of controversial because they were literally digging up the family farm, and every time they came out, the family couldn't stay on the farm and they had to stay elsewhere. David's brother Kerwin said his elderly mother had to be displaced, and that was stressful. He also said his son didn't go to school for 2 weeks because he was being bullied because his uncle was a suspect. He said the searches just cast a negative light on the entire family. I do think his feelings are valid, but I question why he said the searches put a negative light on the family, because David Lycan was already a convicted rapist, so I would think that would put a negative light on the family. And again, just because there's one bad apple in the family, it doesn't mean the whole family is bad, but I think that would have shed a little bit more negative light on the family. But like I said, he's entitled to his feelings. To be displaced from your home and also see the property be dug up, that was no doubt stressful. But the searches did hold up as being legal searches. In 2007, a South Dakota prison inmate who was in the same prison as David Lycan, and I'm going to butcher his name horribly, so I apologize, Aloysius Blackcrow. He came to authorities and said that he had hung out with David Lycan a lot in the prison library, and that David had confessed to him that he had murdered Pam and Sherry. On one occasion when they talked, he had snuck in a tape recorder and had a recorded confession of David Lycan saying that he had murdered the girls. He handed over that tape recording to authorities. This was enough to charge Lycan with their murder, and in July 2007, a grand jury indicted him on 2 counts of felony murder and 2 counts of premeditated murder in the suspected deaths of Pam and Sherry. The trial was going to start in March of 2008, but right before the trial started, Blackcrow came forward and said that he had made everything up, and that the tape recording that he had turned over was actually just of another inmate who was pretending to be Lycan. So without the recorded confession, there was not enough to continue to charge Lycan, and the charges were dropped. But it's not like he went home a free man. He still had that 225-year sentence to serve on his previous charges, so he just went back to prison. Black Crow would plead guilty to perjury, and he received an additional 10 years on his sentence. The Lycan family attorney, Mike Butler, said that it should have been obvious from the start that that was not David Lycan on the recording because it sounded nothing like him, which I interpret him as saying that the authorities so desperately wanted David Lycan to be the suspect that they might have jumped at any chance to charge him. So the case goes cold again, and even more years pass on. On September 18th, 2013, Pam's father, Oscar, passed away at the age of 102. He had never given up searching for his daughter, and that to me is the most touching part of this case because there's nothing quite like a father's love for his daughter. His obituary even mentioned that his greatest sadness in life was Pam's disappearance. That August and September, heavy rains poured down on South Dakota, followed by periods of very little rain. So the rivers and the lakes had volatile levels where they'd be high and then low and then high and then low. On September 23rd, 2013, when the water levels were quite low, a man went on a bridge on 310th Street where it crossed over Brule Creek south of Beersford because he wanted to go fishing. As he looks down at the water, he notices something funny in there. He realizes that it is tires peeking up from underneath the murky water. And it's obviously that there is a car in there upside down. So he calls authorities. Authorities come out and they do try to remove the car, but it starts to fall apart a little bit. So they decide to leave it until they can find a way to pull it out safely. But they were able to raise it out of the water just enough to tell by the bumper that it was a 1960s Studebaker. They could also see the license plate, which matched Sherry's grandfather's license plate. After they do remove the car from the water and are able to inspect it, they find that the key is still in the ignition. It was in third gear. The lights were flipped to on, and there were two skeletons in the front driver's and front passenger seats. One tire did have damage, but they couldn't tell if that had happened before or after the car had went in the water. People were pretty sure that this was probably Sherry and Pam, and when they found Sherry's purse with her driver's license in it, that obviously heavily supported the theory that this was Pam and Sherry. They had also found a watch in the car that had stopped at 10:02 p.m. Remember, they had left Beersford at 9:30 p.m. to head out to the gravel pit, so if a crash had happened on their way to the gravel pit, the timing of that would make sense. Where this bridge was less than a mile from where that gravel pit was. The skeletons still had clothing on, and they were in the positions that you would naturally be in if you were riding in a car. Due to the remains being so old, they were sent to the University of North Texas for DNA testing, and it did take a while to get a definite confirmation, but in early 2014, they did positively confirm the skeletal remains to be that of Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller. South Dakota Attorney General Marty Jackley said no alcohol was involved in the crash. There were no alcohol cans or bottles found in the car. Also, when they talked to the people who the girls had been with that night, they confirmed that the girls had not been drinking. There were no signs of foul play, so it was determined to be just a tragic car accident.
Based upon collectively the totality of the evidence, 42 years worth of the file, as well as the information that was found on September 23rd, 2013, it's consistent with a car accident. Law enforcement and the families never quit searching.
They think as Sherry was driving, she either missed the bridge and went into the water instead. It was late at night in the country when it was dark, so it wouldn't have been well lit. Or they think maybe she lost control of the car while she was on gravel, and that's how it ended up in the ditch. One of the investigators, Chris Wevitt, said that there's damage on the guardrail of the bridge that you can still see to this day, and she thinks that it happened that night. So another possibility is that the car hit the guardrail and then went into the creek. But whatever happened that night, something obviously happened as Sherry was driving that made her lose control, and the car ended up upside down in the creek, and it stayed there undiscovered for 42 years. A statement from the family said, "Our day has come. Through this journey for answers pertaining to our beloved sister Sherry and dear friend Pam, we will now be able to finish the last chapter of this journey. A lot of people feel that it was a shame that Oscar, Pam's dad, died just 5 days before the car was found, when he had spent almost half of his life trying to find out what happened to his daughter. Not to get too religious, I think maybe once Oscar got to heaven, he was able to pull a little bit more strings up there and have his daughter be found. That's all I have for today's case. It is interesting to learn about an old case that was a cold case for so long and to have it finally be solved. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.